R.I.P. Tex Avery, you would have loved the Big Les show.
I don't know what that is.
You don't know what... you're an art historian, you don't know what the Big Les show is?
What's the Big Les show?
It's this, like, animated cartoon. Well, obviously, it's going to be animated if it's a cartoon. Done in MS Paint by this Australian guy. It's brilliant. It's been running for years. I think maybe it's over now. But like the dude made two entire movies on his own in MS Paint.
Before we move on from the wolf, I want to tell you one last story about the wolf because it's so good.
Okay.
Apparently, this he first displayed the wolf character to like an army sergeant, and he showed a scene that was not actually in the theatrical release, but is in a version you can find, where the wolf at the end gets married to the Red Riding Hood's grandma, right? In the Red Hot Riding Hood story, and this is quoting from Wikipedia of all places. The Hayes office found the scene strongly suggested bestiality and was cut for the theatrical release.
Oh,
isn't that cool?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess so we should talk about where these things come in, or why these things are so also interesting for tattooing, artistically speaking, right? Because again, when you find kind of critics writing about Avery's animation style, drawing style, they sort of point out that it's pretty old school, it's pretty kind of traditional, but it's also he just gets a lot of weird energy out of not many lines. Perfect for tattooing. If you look at the way that the wolves are drawn, or the wolf is drawn, the wolf character is drawn, you have these incredible sweeping lines, you have these big, long, exaggerated features, and you can just see how they'd be super quick. Well, because obviously this kind of animation, you're drawing every single frame by hand, or your animation team are, and they have to be quick to draw. They are kind of boiled down and simplified, and that is also the same for tattooing, right? Turning these sketches, turning these funny things that work as sight gags that are grotesque and sexy and funny and masculine as well as kind of nostalgic, all of these things at once, and they're quick and easy to draw, and they look fucking great just with heavy black line work and a bit of color. So cool. And you can see why they still work today, right? Why people are still getting this kind of stuff off of the flash sheets in tattoo shops. And
it goes back to your constant point of people get tattoos of the things they love, the things they hate, the things they want to fuck. And it's it's sex, it's humor, it's hubris, national honor, it's everything all in one. And when we move on to talk about Max Fleischer, it becomes a lot more interesting as well when you have that perspective being created by someone who wasn't born in the US and has a different kind of national view of it.
Yeah, and I think Avery's increasingly kind of cynical of that stuff too, right? There's a bit in the Red Hot Riding Hood short where the wolf basically sort of stops and looks at the camera and says come on, this is too syrupy, this is too safe. We want something more sexy and more interesting. And my other favorite ones from Avery actually are they're called the World of Tomorrow sequence, and they're they're piss takes or parodies of those kind of public information films that were produced in the 40s, which are the home of the future will be, or the car of the future, and they're hilarious because he's clearly fuck this stuff, taking the piss out of industrialists, taking the piss out of techno-utopianism. Everything is a ridiculous joke. There's a carpeting so lush and deep a butler sinks into his neck. A button to fool tax assessors by transforming the house's appearance into a dilapidated hovel. Like, yeah, like it's just it's full of cynicism. Like, Disney is not cynical at all, and like Avery stuff is like really really cynical.
Yeah, but it's I think him being from Texas also influences it, like this kind of like idea of like red-blooded Americanism, but also Texas and its historical kind of standpoint as an opposition to like the monoculture and state of the US, that like growing up surrounded by, you know, quote unquote good old boys and like people, you know, Texas is Texas, it's not the US. It kind of maybe in some roundabout way helped form this kind of skeptical mindset that he brought into his cartoons.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And like, yeah, it's again, not obviously none of this it was in any way visible to me as a kid, but coming back to it all with the light of an art history education and knowing about history and thinking about these things like masculinity and sexuality and, you know, economic politics and all this kind of stuff. Like, it's really, really interesting that he gets to exist on these two levels at the same time, right? I just think that's incredible. So yeah, I mean, I guess like maybe the last thing we should just quickly mention here, and maybe it is a bit of a segue then potentially to talk about the other person we want to talk about today, Fleischer, which is this issue of like of minstrelsy and blackface as an origin for this stuff. There's again a really amazing book that I can recommend to listeners called "Birth of an Industry" by Nicholas Salmond, Blackface Minstrelsy and the Rise of American Animation. And like the reason that, you know, Mickey Mouse and Felix the Cat and to a lesser degree characters like Betty Boop as well exist is because they emerge from like blackface minstrelsy, basically, like particularly Mickey Mouse and Felix the Cat, Steamboat Willie. There are kind of racialized gags in the Avery cartoons as well. There's a short called Lucky Ducky where these like characters kind of, you know, they're out hunting and the shotgun shells backfire and they end up with blackface. All of this stuff is sort of paralleling and emerging out of the long and sad and terrifying and evil history of minstrel shows, which are mocking and appropriating and you know, demeaning plantation or culture that emerged from plantations in the late 19th and early 20th century. Like all of this stuff, the reason that Mickey Mouse wears white gloves, right? That's because he's a blackface minstrel character, basically. And like, you know, this stuff is now so divorced from that we can't straightforward it's so many steps away that we can't say Mickey Mouse is straightforwardly a minstrel character, but he emerges from minstrelsy, right? Bugs Bunny to some degree as well. Like all of these characters like have rooting in black-faced mockeries, right? Of enslaved people in the United States. Like Fleischer's studio, if we're moving on to him, had its own kind of character called Coco the Clown, right? And Warner Brothers had Bosco, who was their kind of Mickey Mouse ripoff.
Not to be confused with
right?
Not to be confused with Ireland's Bosco.
No, different people entirely.
Did you know what Bosco is?
So I've heard of Bosco. Yeah.
Okay. It looks like Raggedy Ann for anyone who's interested.
Yeah. So I want to quote here from Salmon. So he quotes from initially from a guy called George Walker, who was a performer, writing in 1906. And there's going to be some racialized language here in quotation marks. So this is George Walker. When we were not working, we frequented the playhouses just the same. In those days, black-faced white comedians were numerous and very popular. They billed themselves as coons. Burt Williams and I watched the white coons, and we were often much amused at seeing white men with black cork on their faces trying to imitate black folks. Nothing about these white men's actions was natural, and therefore nothing was as interesting if black performers had been dancing and singing their own songs in their own way. And that's one of the points here, right? This is like, as jazz and black music and black comedy became popular, this was a way for white people to do it, so they didn't have to hire black people, basically. And so, Sammons goes on, says, this book has taken an its central object, continuing cartoon characters, the drawn versions of animals and people behind which animation studios made their individual names, such as Disney's Mickey Mouse, the Fleischer Studios' Coco the Clown and Bimbo, and Warner Brothers' Bosco, Daffy Duck, and Bugs Bunny. Appearing in commercial cartoon after cartoon, these characters served as living trademarks for their makers, and all were minstrels. These trademark minstrels, these living commodities, have much to say about the political economy of American commercial animation in its formative stages. These tunes weren't merely modelled after minstrels, they were rather performing minstrelry in a different modality. They were and are one more facet in a much larger matrix of racialized and racist performances that works to situate blackness and whiteness in a fantastic relationship with each other. Like this kind of, all these characters and all of these tropes, the use, for example, with Betty Boop, a character created by Max Fleischer in 1930, this jazz age flapper, like the reason that jazz is popular and these become part of the American culture and therefore in cartoons is because of this particular history of appropriation of African American and enslaved people's cultural tropes, right? Super complicated. I mean, we're not sort of saying that anyone who's got a Betty Boop tattoo or Betty Boop in its contemporary context is a racist character, but like it's interesting, I think, to think about where these come from and why they're such a part of mainstream American and therefore kind of global culture, right?